event is streamed live. And so we hope that many more people who are not in Marrakesh with us will be able to follow the event. So once again, welcome to this side event, Addressing Loss and Damage in Developing Countries, co-organized by ACT Alliance and the Center for Science and Environment in India. This issue is particularly important for both organizations represented here because increasingly it is a major challenge in developing countries and with the people and communities that we work with. From ACT Alliance perspective, climate change, climate policy and climate action does need to begin with communities that are affected for the opportunity to see what kind of vulnerabilities they are facing and how to address them in the context of the Paris Agreement, both at national level and at international level, is critically important. I have the pleasure to introduce our panel of experts and eminent persons, and I will just name them and I will kindly ask them to just say hello, and then we will go into our session. And so the first one is Sabina Mininga, policy advisor, Bread for the World in Germany, as well as a policy advisor for the ACT Alliance. The second panelist is Dr. Chandra Bhushan, who is the Deputy Director General for the Center for Science and Environment in India. And then we have with us as well Dr. Peter Terfa, the head of climate change department from the government of Nigeria. He is on his way here. He hasn't joined us, but he will join us. He's just informed us that he's running from another side event. We do have Mr. Godfrey von Jarmingen from the German delegation, who is also a member of the Warsaw International Mechanism. And then last but not least, we've got Ms. Teresia Powell, who is a member of the Fiji delegation. All right, in terms of how the day will go, we will receive the input from our expert panel, and then after that, we will have an interactive session where all the participants are invited to ask questions and to make comments. I do hope that our session will be quite interactive, and I also encourage the panelists as well, when the opportunity presents itself, to engage with the comments and the input from the other participants. We would really like to have this as a dialogue that would help us understand where we are with regards to loss and damage and what kind of actions would be imperative to ensure that we are serving communities and that we are adequately dealing with this massive, massive challenge. It is my pleasure then to give the floor to Dr. Chandra, who will introduce some of the findings of a recent study that he has worked on. Welcome.
I'll be there.
Yeah.
Not working? Excuse me. Before we sort this out, good morning. I'm Chandra Bhushan, and I work at Center for Science and Environment. Center for Science and Environment is a non-governmental organization working in the field of environment in India, partly in South Asia and East Africa. And the presentation that I'm going to give today is based on our year-long research, looking at the impact of climate change on small and marginal farmers. And therefore, the kind of risk sharing, risk management, and risk transfer mechanism that is going to become important in the future to safeguard these farmers from the impacts of climate change. Can we be started? Can I operate it sitting there? I can do that. Okay. I do remember my presentation, so let me speak. Okay, it doesn't matter whether it comes or not. I wanted to start with a case study. For the past few months, we have been documenting the impact of climate change on farmers. And I wanted to give you a case study, the first part of my presentation, about a farmer in northern part of India. Now, this farmer happens to be a farmer who takes land on rent. He is a landless laborer. He would take land on rent from a landholder. Then he would go to the market and raise loan as for input cost. So this farmer, whose name is Kedar Singh, last year during the winter crops, picked up a loan of $3,000. He paid $600 for land rent, $2,000 for input costs for potato crop, and $400 to take care of his family for 3 months. And he had a bumper crop, excellent crop. The valuation of his crop was about $12,000. His input cost, his loan was $3,000 plus the labor that he and his family put in. And he got an output of about $12,000. Now he had so much crop that he couldn't store it at his house. So he went to cold storage. And in his district, which is a subdivision in India, there are about 250. The weather was so good, the crop was so excellent that all the cold storages were filled. He stood in line for 3 days to store his crop. So he went back to his field and put the crop on the field. Bam! Next day, he had hailstorm that destroyed his entire crop. $3,000 loan, a crop that could have given him $12,000 income. Within a second, it was gone. He was in such a shock, he got a heart attack and he died. Now, these kinds of incidents are becoming common in our part of the world where the freak events, the so-called extreme weather events, whether it is hailstorm, extreme rainfall events, are destroying lives and livelihoods of the people. Now, this chap didn't have insurance. He had nothing to fall back on. He had excellent crop, and therefore, from climate adaptation point of view, he had done everything right. But within a minute, this happened. You had hailstorm of 250 grams hitting his field and destroying everything. It killed people, it killed animals, it destroyed crops. But the fact is, as I said, this is no more a freak event in our part of the world. This is becoming the norm. Extreme weather events are the reality that we have to deal with every day in large part of this world. And if you look at this data, which is a data compiled by EMDAT, on average number of extreme weather events per year by decade from 1900 to 2010, we had just 2.5 extreme weather events per decade in the first decade of 1900, and we are now talking about 350 extreme weather events. These numbers are increasing, and these numbers are going to increase more. We are only talking about 1.2 degrees temperature increase. We are in for 1.5, moving to 2, and God knows 3. Now, And there's now a body of knowledge which now shows that it is going to be the poor who are going to be unevenly affected by the climate change. Whether you look at AR5, which conclusively proves that developing countries and poor in developing countries will bear disproportionately high impact of climate change. For example, of the 10 most affected countries due to extreme weather event in 1994-2013 decade, 9 were developing countries. SREX 2011, least developed countries lost 0.3% of their GDP annually because of extreme weather events. And agriculture is emerging as a sector which is getting affected the most, largely because it supports large number of people. So even in terms of economic numbers, say only about a fourth of all the economic loss because of extreme weather event is in agriculture sector, the number of people affected in agriculture sector is just too high. And therefore, these losses are wiping out lives, livelihoods of people, and they are creating new poverty traps. That's what is happening in our part of the world. And these trends will exacerbate in future. Again, taking back you to India, this is a map of India affected, agriculture sector in India affected by extreme rainfall events. In 2013, about 0.35 million hectares of crops were damaged because of extreme weather event. 2014, 5.5 million hectares. In 2015, 18.23 million hectares. So we are witnessing increasing impact of climate change, extreme weather events on our agriculture sector. And if you look at the recent report of FAO, it warns that in business as usual scenario, the number of poor people can increase between 35 to 122 million by 2020. So instead of reducing poverty, that should have been the priority of all the action on climate change, we are looking at increasing poverty. How do we deal with vulnerability in agriculture sector? What do we do? These are the things that we are doing. In India, for example, we are improving cropping pattern, livestock, land and water management. Most countries are doing this or trying to do this. We are introducing climate risk assessment and management tools like weather data, early warning system. We are getting people out of agriculture because we know that agriculture is going to be the most vulnerable sector and it is going to cost us. Whatever data is available, it tells us that billions of dollars will be required to do all these things. But the fact is, these are not going to be sufficient. And therefore, we have to talk beyond adaptation. Again, we have now a body of knowledge that says that adaptation is going to be good till a certain point. And that's where we start talking about loss and damage. Whether you look at IPCC AR4 report or the US National Assessment, which is probably one of the best assessment on adaptation that came out, it is quite clear that adaptation has limitations. And therefore, we have to talk beyond adaptation. And therefore, there is a growing demand in our part of the world, in most developing countries, to put in place mechanism to build safety nets for agriculture sector. And largely, the talk is about crop and livestock insurance. What is the status of agriculture insurance in our part of the world? Frankly, nil. Agriculture insurance is widely used only in developed countries. If you exclude China and Japan, the only about 5% of global agriculture insurance premium comes from developing countries. And that's one of the indicators to tell you how many farmers are insured for climate risk or any other risk. And only about 100 million people in developing countries are covered by some sort of agriculture insurance. About 100 million people. The other fact about agriculture insurance is it is not possible to do agriculture insurance without government support. Now, this is the data that gives you some idea about how governments are supporting agriculture insurance. For example, in US and Canada, 73% of all the agriculture premium is supported by government, subsidized by government. In Europe, 37%. In Latin America, 36%. Africa, it's only 3% because African governments can't afford agriculture insurance. Asia, about 50%, largely in China and Japan. So it's quite clear that without subsidized premium, agriculture insurance is not possible in developing countries. And therefore, we need to talk about a globally supported mechanism. If farmers can't afford, if countries can't afford, we can't leave our farmers, marginal and small farmers, like that. And therefore, it is quite clear that we will need risk transfer mechanism. Farmers will not be able to afford it. Many countries will not be able to afford it. I'll give you a data about India. We did a study, and we found that India will require $30 billion, $13 billion every year to provide universal agriculture and livestock insurance. Of that, 10 billion will have to be subsidy. Then only we can have universal agriculture insurance. So we are proposing that we should establish a globally supported agriculture insurance mechanism. Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage seems the most appropriate platform to set up such a mechanism. And therefore, we propose that Warsaw International Mechanism should conduct pilot projects globally, share best practices, mobilize resources, and promote collaboration towards creating a global agriculture insurance mechanism by 2022. That's the proposal. Based on all the study that we have done, we have come out with. There are a lot of work that has happened in Marrakesh on loss and damage. Let me not get into the detail, just to say that we are in the right track. And all the work that is happening right now, including the technical paper on assessing financial support for loss and damage, can be used to push for a globally supported agriculture insurance mechanism. My colleagues have distributed a small paper to all of you, which details out how we can get this mechanism in place. Let me end by saying that in August 2016, we got more than 20 countries together to discuss this global agriculture insurance program in Kenya. We had participants from Asia and Africa. We had agriculture department, finance department. We didn't get any climate change department. We got people who are going to implement this agriculture insurance mechanism, insurance companies to come and discuss this. And we came out with principles and features. If we want to do this, then what should be the principle and features which should underpin a globally supported agriculture insurance mechanism? And some of the features, the details are there in the paper, but let me just reiterate them to you here. We believe that it should be based on equity and climate justice. It is clear that insurance can never be the first response. And one of the fear most of us have, that insurance will become the first response. But the fact is, risk transfer has to be the last response. It cannot be the first response. Therefore, focus on insurance should not take away focus from adaptation and mitigation. Insurance is also likely to create uniform agriculture practices, which should not be acceptable, and therefore sustainable agriculture practices should be promoted. Profit maximization cannot be done with agriculture insurance, as is being done with other insurance projects. Then we came out with other ideas on what should UNFCCC process should support, including financial support, technical support to developing countries. But one thing which became quite clear in this meeting, that you cannot have a top-down insurance mechanism. It has to be a bottom-up insurance mechanism where microfinance, local companies, corporations, reinsurance companies, everyone will have to come together to develop such a mechanism. And funding for this, we discussed in length, should come based on an index which is based on responsibility for causing climate change and capability for supporting a global mechanism such as agriculture insurance mechanism. Let me end by saying this, that we are at the right time in history to do this. Across the developing world, there is demand to set in place agriculture insurance mechanism. Ethiopia, Tanzania, South Africa, Mali, Mozambique, everyone is experimenting with pilots on agriculture insurance. Nigeria and Kenya are planning comprehensive agriculture insurance program. Nepal, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, India, China, across the world, people are looking at agriculture insurance. Now, we should make sure that we get this right. We cannot get this wrong. And there is tendency in insurance to get it wrong. And that's where we need to work hard to get agriculture insurance right. Developed countries are interested in supporting it. We have G7's Insure Resilience Initiative, which aims to cover 400 million people in developing country for agriculture insurance. Developing countries want it. Developed countries want to support it. We have a platform to implement it. I think we should do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bhushan. I will give the floor to our colleague from Germany, Mr. Gottfried Jermingen, who is a member of the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee, but also who is a representative and a delegate from the German government. You have the floor, Mr. Jermingen.
Thank you very much for hosting the side event. Please excuse me, I don't have prepared any presentation, and I even haven't prepared any speaking points. It's the last day. I think we've been full of discussions, full of negotiations, which were greatly sketched by Mr. Bhushan. I think there's so much to talk about it, and just please stop me. I fully endorse the principles you came up. I mean, I couldn't endorse them more. Equity and climate justice should be the cornerstone. I mean, we've just started the CMA. I hope we'll get to an agenda and to the first decision by today or later today or tonight. We haven't grasped that we entered in a new era 2 days ago. A new era where everybody takes, to varying degree, responsibility. And so there's no black and white anymore. There are different shades of gray. But so everybody has to take responsibility, but we have to do it together. And I think the Global Climate Action Agenda showed that there's a lot of creativity outside of the negotiation rooms, whereas the negotiations are very, very difficult. So let's focus on doing things together. I also agree with you saying insurance is not the first response. Insurance does not reduce risk. It helps everybody addressing those risks in a better manner, and it helps by becoming aware of a risk, because that's the precondition for insurance, is that you know what is your risk to better manage your risk. And one aspect which you also mentioned was sustainable agricultural practice. This is a precondition. It's the same with health insurance. If you live an unhealthy life, then your health insurance doesn't help you. It could even lead to bad behavior, which I'm not an insurance expert, but insurance experts call it moral hazard. So we need to be very sensitive to that. If insurance leads to unsustainable agricultural practices, then no insurance will ever work. Profit maximization should not be the motive. I fully endorse this. Insurance can help us manage risks better, but it's not the aim to help insurance companies to make a better profit. We are. Since we also are very much pushing forward the Insure Resilience, the G7 initiative, and it has gone far beyond the G7 already. It's getting a much broader basis. And insurance, and we have been engaging with the big global insurance corporations and reinsurance corporations. They say if we, for example, engage in regional risk pools or in agricultural insurance, if we promote that, that's not where we in the future, in the medium and long term, make profits. We make profits if the societies become more resilient, get out of poverty, and one key is insurance for that, and the scope for them in engaging in placing products at the markets will tremendously increase for that. And I think that is an important message. So sustainable development will develop markets also for insurance and for others. But we use insurance as a tool for strengthening resilience, for getting the basics right, in so that societies can move out of poverty on the various levels. And the next principle was integration of insurance with other programs. I mean, this is just what we try to do, and you nicely sketched it. Also, that adaptation and risk finance, loss and damage finance need to go together. That's why I do have I do not only have a political problem with having this distinct and separate, I also do have a conceptual problem. It needs, we work along a risk continuum. It addresses mitigation, which you also mentioned, adaptation, and adaptation is risk mitigation. It reduces risk. And if we come to economical assessments of marginal cost analysis, then we can have maybe a better also analytical basis to say, well, up to a certain extent, it makes complete sense to do adaptation, but only to a certain extent. And there are residual risks, which we need to become much more aware of. And for these residual risks, which probably cannot be taken away, insurance can be one tool, only one. And there are other risks like slow onset events where we maybe do not yet have appropriate approaches to address them, technically, political, and that's why we also cannot yet develop financial instruments for addressing those. But that doesn't mean that it's impossible. We can do that. For example, creating, helping, assisting poor and vulnerable people to develop financial buffers so that they are prepared once fishing populations or livelihoods collapse, that they have a buffer in order to for transformational adaptation, for getting another livelihood. So I could not agree with your principles. I have a problem in starting, and you also mentioned we need to foster bottom-up approaches. I think all these insurance approaches, they are, you also mentioned them, there is a huge plethora out there, but there's also, and you talked rightly about the topic of premium subsidies, and no agricultural insurance in the world works without premium subsidies. But there's also a plethora of pilots which were unsustainable, which worked for some years, and then follow-up funding was not there. We need to find another way. So I would, and the way we try to engage in resilience is to work on various levels. Risk layering is very important, working on the micro level, but the micro level is also quite demanding to roll out micro insurance on a large scale, because you need a lot of information for it, weather data infrastructure, and climate information service infrastructure needs to get in place. And this is a cumbersome activity. So I would be very cautious in rolling out plans which maybe only come into effect in 5, 10 years or 15 years from now. We need to prepare now. So that's why we said, let's focus on sovereign risk pools, like the Caribbean and Central American risk insurance facility, African risk capacity. We just established in close coordination amongst the G7 with the World Bank, also the Pacific Climate Risk Insurance Facility. I don't say that these are panaceas. I mean, these are instruments, new instruments, which we set in place, and we still have a steep learning curve. And affordability is one aspect which we need to think about it. But it's a tool we can work with. And I can tell you that we are engaging with these regional risk pools also to develop micro insurance products, because they have these institutions are there. They are working with parametric insurance solutions. They have the whole algorithms in place. Why not spreading their their wings down to the ground. And so in the Caribbean, for example, when Hurricane Matthew swept through the region, there was immediate payout after 2 weeks by CRIF, by the Caribbean Risk Insurance Facility. 30 million, almost 30 million US dollars, mainly to Haiti, but also to other countries. What was less known was that CRIF had developed a livelihood protection policy, a micro insurance product, which also paid out 3 million US dollars to people who bought that insurance. These were smallholder farmers. These were small entrepreneurs. So you can see that these pools can be one platform and scaling down to the micro level. And of course, you mentioned also various numbers of national schemes, and we're engaging with our partners in order to scale up those. And we are also considering, if you look at this landscape, the global landscape of climate risk insurance instruments on the various levels, we need to also reflect the whole picture and then look at what makes sense. Where can we still increase effectiveness or efficiency? So that's then the global level. But we would like to, like a mosaic, make it more denser, and then gradually we get to a global picture. Personally, I don't think that it's the right approach to start with a global mechanism. I don't know which the delivery mechanisms would be. And I'm sitting in the XCOM. It's a 20 members body. Others are also here in the room. And what we can do is collecting the information, providing sharing expertise, and then giving recommendations to the COP or the CMA, and what can the convention do. And the convention, from my point of view, has very much a catalytic role there. There's a lot out there, and I think the G7 initiative has initiated what's like throwing a stone into a water where the water was flat. So a huge dynamic was initiated through that, and I can tell you it's difficult to manage this dynamic. And I think for the Warsaw mechanism, thank you, it would be very good to reflect the dynamic and working as we just agreed upon within 2 years, coming up with a consolidated picture and then provide some recommendation to the CMA what the work under the convention could potentially do. And I would leave this open. I would like to stop now. My time is anyway open, although I could continue for hours. But so let's give it some trust. There's a lot of movement going on. We can do something together, and I think this is such kind of a connotation is, from my point of view, much more appropriate to the new era we just entered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jamigan. I'm going to give the floor immediately to our sister, Ms. Teresia Powell, coming to us from Fiji. You have the floor, Ms. Powell. Yeah.
First, I would like to introduce myself, Teresia from Fiji. I guess I'm just wondering whether I'm in the right room or not. I'm not talking about insurance here, and I'm not going to talk about agriculture. I will talk about loss and damage when it deals with human beings. Fiji, we already moving due to the impact of sea level rise. Maybe there is where the insurance that my colleague just talked about can come and help us in terms of the impact of climate change that is happening in Fiji. To those who don't know where is Fiji If you look through the map, maybe it's really hard for you to find it. It's quite invisible. It's very small. Talking about the 40,000 people that's staying here in the COP22, maybe when you all come to Fiji, Fiji might move or might drown. I'm talking about how vulnerable we are. We are surrounded by oceans. We have 330 islands. And yes, we already filled and we're already moving due to the impact of sea level rise. Talking about vulnerability, you can see from there the population of Fiji. We're made up of islands. Our land area is very small compared to where you come from, where you have your land mass as 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times as ours. My case study is on the first relocated community in Fiji, Vunindongloa, talking about loss and damage. We're already there. We are affected by the cyclone earlier this year, Cyclone Winston, but Vunindongloa was relocated due to the impact of the TC Thomas in 2010. Fiji, we have a climate change policy. We followed our development plan, the Green Growth Framework as our guideline, and Suva Declaration. I also welcome the incurring of loss and damage as a separate article from adaptation in the Paris Agreement, Article 8, as this has been a position as per the Suva Declaration. For your information, not only Vunindongloa is relocated, that is a planned relocation, but there's other community that relocate on their own. We also have one that is coming up, that is Narikoso, and also Winisabsabi, a partial relocated community. I'm sorry, I'm not really close to the first presentation. I'm talking about loss and damage in regards to human. This is just a case study. This is Vunindongloa, as before. That is the old site that is already vacated, where community already moved. Engagement of community in the relocation process. I'm talking about relocation. There's other term like displacement, other term like retreat, refugees. I'm not really sure which term that is appropriate for us. In terms of decision making, I guess community needs to be involved in terms of assessment, in terms of house plan, in terms of the site where the community will be moved to, and even in terms where they have to be involved in the decision making of village and council meeting. You can see from there in that, that is the new site where the community moved to, upperland, far from the sea, where they can build themselves in terms of their livelihood assets. Awareness and capacity building is important. The inclusion of community. You can see from there that these mothers, they went to a barefoot college in India, where they went and learned how to implement solar. That is Vunindongloa. You can see this, the top picture where the community lit up. That was done by the lady down below. She was the one that implemented solar in the community. In terms of sustainability, women needs to be included in decision making and also in capacity building. Leadership role, community needs to lead. It has to be an integrated approach where they contributed in decision making, especially in terms of relocation. Socioeconomic activities is very important. I'm talking from the Pacific concept. I'm talking from the Pacific experience. I guess if some of you won't be able to put this into reality, but this is really happening in the Pacific countries. To my neighbors, Tonga, Tuvalu, Kiribati, we all experience this. Culture and traditional arts is an important component in Fiji and in the Pacific Islands. It builds resilience and also increase adaptive capacity in terms of the impact of disaster and even climate change. There is another relocation, the partial relocation that was funded by the USAID CCAP that helps the community to move upland. I won't take much of your time. The success, I guess the community's willingness to relocate. The community needs to be willing to move. Otherwise, then it will be a hard process. Community contribution is important as well. So in terms of sense of ownership, to facilitate, there needs to be there. The involvement of the church, Pacific countries, a majority are Christians, And the leaders of the church are very influential in terms of anything that happens in the community. We live as kin, we live as close relationship, and it's important that this role has to be included in terms of implementing projects at the community level. I'm coming down from international, national, maybe you'll hear that I'm going down right now to the community level. No land or communal dispute. Land system is very important and it's crucial in terms of relocation. Availability of assistance from the government. Government needs to be there. They have to be there in terms of giving assistance to the community when it's need to be relocated, or community that is badly affected by the impact of climate change. It has to be an integrated approach. Communities' participation is crucial in terms of relocation. In the case of the Pacific, like I said, they live as a community, they live as a family. When you move them, you have to move them together. Frequent communication, government intervention, like I said before. This is our challenges. There's less local communities that experience the adverse climate and environmental changes to have the opportunity to voice their needs and requests. Lack of financial resources. Moving communities is very expensive. In terms of funding, in your community, you're talking about not expensive in terms of money only, but in terms of spiritual, in terms of psychological, in terms of social. It's all incorporated there. That's why I said it's very expensive to move communities. Maybe that is where climate insurance will come in. Coping with disconnection, losing the bond, place of identity, your cultural connection, your fishing ground, your playground. This is really important to us. Church gathering, your familiar site every day, your social gathering. These are the things that affected us when we move from where we think we belong, where we identify ourselves. When we move with this disconnection. And then you have to welcome the new. Then another challenge. Recommendation, there are a few recommendations that is up there. I will go to the second bullet point. It should be an integrated and ecosystem-based approach. It has to be gender inclusive. Respond to social cultural preferences is very, very important. Relocation should be thorough and very slow. You are dealing with a lot of things when you move a community. Better structure, better institutional framework is important. Relocation should be the last climate change adaptation option where you reach loss and damage. Identify and acquire suitable alternative locations, stable sites. After this relocation, these are one of the first relocation in the region, the planned relocation in Fiji. That is where Fiji comes in now, a draft Fiji relocation guideline, and that will be drafted, and maybe that will be endorsed in the end of the year or in the coming year. Thank you for listening. You can see from that slide, that is where Wunundongla was in 10 decades. Now you can see that we're already halfway into the sea. There is a reason they were moved upland because of the impact of sea level rise that compounded to their moving.
Thank you very much, Ms. Powell. And indeed, the case study and the example you've given us is at the heart of loss and damage, and it's at the heart of the work that ACT Alliance and CSE are working on with regards to this issue. I'm going to give the floor, without any further ado, to Dr. Peter Tarfa, who is the head of the climate change departments in the government of Nigeria. And Dr. Tarfa is also a member of the Adaptation Fund Board. Sir, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, distinguished delegates. It's a pleasure to be at this site event this afternoon and to share some of our experiences back in Nigeria. Basically, I'm going to talk as a negotiator and as a focal point for Nigeria, but to give just a short perspective. I also don't have a prepared slide, but I will just highlight some of the situations that we felt is very critical in pursuing the agenda of loss and damage. First and foremost, from a national perspective, we had an unprecedented flooding in the year 2012, which displayed over 12 million people and their animals, and it destroyed several livelihoods and habitations. The agricultural sector and the infrastructure were the most affected. It's important to contextualize that Nigeria, unlike Fiji, is a huge country with over 923 square kilometers. And also it has a population of about 175 million people. It is impacted in different fronts because we have the major economic activities of the country is along the coastal line of the Atlantic Ocean, and therefore any sea level rise will inundate our economic activities, including the oil infrastructures. In the same vein too, we have the desertification encroaching into the country from the far north of Nigeria. And we all are aware of the security challenges that is happening at that part of the country, which could be attributed totally or partially to issues of climate change. Therefore, to us, like any other developing countries, issues of adaptation are our priority. But certainly what is happening now is far beyond adaptation. We welcome the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, which we see it as a formidable structure to enable national governments to be able to come up with policies and measures that will help to cope with the impact of climate change. We have in Nigeria an agricultural insurance scheme, but this the agricultural insurance scheme has some limitation. There's a need, instead of going forward to canvass for a globally supported agricultural insurance mechanism, I am of the view that the national efforts should be so integrated, it should be so supported. So the Warsaw International Mechanism should come up with a blueprint. That is where the negotiators also have a central role to play to ensure that data is generated at the national level. And then we also build a national insurance mechanism, which can now fit into the global one that we are talking about. I agree that the negotiators should argue on the fair, affordable, simple, and inclusive mechanism, because this is a critical issue that is affecting majorly the developing countries. From the negotiators' perspective, I will just want to say that it is essential that we ensure that the issues of the agricultural insurance mechanism is on the agenda of the Warsaw International Mechanism. Once we don't get it, once it drops off of the negotiations, certainly there will not be a pathway to continue in pursuing it. Another critical thing or another recommendation I will make is to ensure that research institutions just like the Center for Science and Environment keeps on coming with argument, with data, with scientific facts and figures that will help the negotiators to actually put across the need for this globally supported agricultural insurance mechanism. I did say that we should start with a national agricultural insurance mechanism rather than a globally supported one. Now, Fiji has highlighted their critical challenge, which is really, really very central, to note that adaptation will not be able to solve the challenge that we are seeing on ground. We have also a similar situation that the middle part of Nigeria, the middle belt, is now being under a lot of pressure because of the sea level rise on the southern part of the country. There's massive movement of people into the center of the country. The desertification problem in the northern part is equally forcing movement. So there is a lot of environmental refugees coming into the center of the country. And how do we really address such an issue? This is even beyond issue of adaptation, but it is something that the mechanism under the loss and damage should be a very critical avenue for us to see how to tackle this. This is just a typical example from Nigeria, which I believe it is also continent-wise and as well as globally. I was privileged some few months back to be at the event that was organized, the workshop that was organized by the Center for Science and Environment in Nairobi, where we highlighted these issues. On getting back home, we have called the sectors responsible for the agriculture as well as the insurance to put heads together to see the possibility of keying into this and coming up with a lot of arsenal that we should put into the negotiation. This is a work in progress, but I want to commend the center for such an initiative, and we want to assure that from the negotiators' perspective, if we have the scientific facts and figures, we'll push it through in the negotiation. Thank you very much.
We thank you very much, Dr. Tafa, for your input. I now give the floor to Ms. Sabina Mininger from Bread for the World, who will conclude our panel introduction and panel input, and then we will go soon after that to receiving your comments and your thoughts. Sabina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. If you don't mind, I feel more comfortable sitting here within you guys. I want to start with something what I found actually really inspiring. The first slide, Chandra, that you have presented, the freak becomes norm. So 10 years ago, it started that Bread for the World with the ACT Alliance highlighted the fact that people are already suffering loss and damage. So our partners from Bread for the World all over in the Global South made the experience that they were unable to adapt to climate change. So we started to flag that issue within the UNFCCC. And when I started, it was like a year before Copenhagen and around Copenhagen, we put this topic on the table, and negotiators looked at us as if we would be completely out of our mind to come up with this topic. So it was the freak. It was the freak. And it is so good to see that this freak became now the norm, that I'm sitting here with delegates, not only from the Global South, but also from the Global North. And therefore, thank you, Gottfried, because also 10 years ago, you already had discussions with us, and not only today, when it was already, when it became the norm. So I appreciate always that we had the possibility to have this open discussion about it. And now we don't have to discuss anymore. We can ask now for concrete actions. And therefore, we also appreciate very much the Insure Resilience Initiative that was launched by the G7 and also followed by many other countries from the industrialized countries, and that they supported this Insure Resilience financially. And it made it a meaningful instrument. And of course, this instrument can only be efficient if it is affordable for countries and if it is designed in a way that it is based on the needs of the people. You have heard this already. That's not what I want to go deeper in. I just want to highlight the role that we have as a humanitarian network, because I believe that a humanitarian network and our development organizations, the members in the countries, they would probably be most appropriate in the distribution of these funds to ensure that no one will be left behind. I mean, there are problems with marginalized people and who never have access to public support. And therefore, we offer our support to this Insure Resilience as ACT Alliance, that we want to be involved in it. And I hope that we get more and more involved. In 5 years, we come back here and we are like a main player in it. That is what we want to see. Then affordable. It is appreciated that the premium is subsidized, but it is not enough. We see, for example, a country like Tuvalu. I visited Tuvalu in September. After I visited Fiji, the village of Vunidogoloa, I went to Tuvalu and I had a lot of conversations there. And the country with 11,000 people is unable to join this kind of insurance because they cannot pay the premium. It is too high for them. They actually are very interested to join it because they saw that, for example, the help that was reached to Vanuatu after the cyclone Winston happened, it reached them within 5 days. So it is an efficient instrument, and therefore we also support it because it's one concrete example on financing loss and damage and helping people to get back on their feet. And it is highly efficient because also we are criticized. Why would we support a market-based mechanism? Then why would people have to pay at all if they become victims of climate change? That's true. It's a good, valid question. But I see at least this is working. Why, for example, Fiji waited 7 months after Winston for help, and it is still not there completely. The international donor community becomes really weak, and it's not that they put like all the time money on the table as a charity. So this mechanism in this way is like highly efficient working. It has to become cheaper. It has to become more affordable. And of course, a country like Tuvalu with 11,000 people should not pay at all for it. That brings me to my second topic, that of course we need finance for loss and damage that goes far beyond an insurance. And what we see so far is that finance only for adaptation is less than 20% of the overall climate finance, and loss and damage is even not tackled. At least we got out here of Marrakesh that there is at least a hope that in 2019 there will be a dialogue, a report coming on loss and damage that hopefully will open the doors for a bigger finance discussion. But so far there is zero money on the table. And that is, of course, a scandal because it will increase, loss and damage will increase, and the costs will increase. And I think we have to discuss loss and damage finance much more in connection with mitigation efforts and also with the capacities that is provided for adaptation. And if you get this ruled and framed, and then you see that there is a moral obligation to also put money for loss and damage on the table. So that is a big topic for ACT Alliance. We will continue working on this, and we will ensure that in our efforts, no one will be left behind.
Thank you so much input, and thank you all to all our panelists for wonderful input and analysis and discussions today. I am going to open the floor for comments and questions, but before I do that, I'd like to highlight 3 things that I personally have learned from the panel today. And I think it is quite critically important to note that loss and damage as a policy issue is no longer in the periphery of political discussions and climate change work. And so it is quite important to appreciate the distance that we have worked and the fact that it is now at the center of negotiations. I think the panelists also have affirmed the work of the Warsaw International Mechanism and indeed recommends it as a positive step moving forward, and the negotiations around how to strengthen it and how to make sure that it continues to provide leadership and guidance on addressing loss and damage is critically important. The third point for me is related to risk transfer and the concept of insurance for communities that are affecting significant losses and damage related to their livelihoods and the economies. And so indeed, that has been affirmed as part and parcel of solutions, and that it should be considered and ensured that access to these and that the participation of communities and that the affordability related to that is critical to our addressing loss and damage. I will open the floor. We've got a couple of microphones roving. So I will take the first 4 questions or comments. Please introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and the country you come from, and then ask your question and keep it short. So I'm gonna take these 2, the gentleman, the lady, and the other gentleman.
Jayanta Basu from Telegraph India. In the Marrakesh call, the final draft that we have in our hand, there is a mention of, which is a departure from the earlier draft, that we call for all parties to strengthen and support efforts to eradicate poverty, ensure food security. It was there before, but finally, to deal with climate change challenges in agriculture. That has been an addition to the final draft. So is it actually opening up a window? That I need to know. But on the other hand, there is no direct reference to loss and damage in this document. Is it a hindrance? So there's 2 ways about it. Mention of agriculture is there, but there is no loss and damage direct reference. Chandra has pointed out there's a lot of work being going on, Warsaw International Mechanism and all, but that's not being reflected in that document. If one particular thing missing is here is the loss and damage, reference to loss and damage. So your thoughts on that?
Hello, everyone. My name is Julie Lennox. I work for the Economic Commission for Latin America, based in Mexico. And we're working with the Ministries of Agriculture and Insurance institutions in Central America, trying to design new insurance schemes for the sector, and trying to share experiences within the region and from the rest of the world. Unfortunately, most of the experiences, as our colleagues on the panel said, have not been sustainable. We, I think, are trying to learn more from our errors than from successful experiences. And we would be interested in learning about experiences regarding risk reduction and sustainable adaptation linked to insurance. So more integrated support for smallholders. And if there are any insurance schemes that have an economic incentives for adaptation and livelihood resilience. Sometimes we see it in other forms of insurance. So that would be a question to the panel. And what are their comments on co-benefits? I think we need to make more evident the relationship between small farmers and food security and ecosystem services. Thank you.
Hello, I am Christine Kaya. I come from Uganda. I coordinate the Parliamentary Forum on Climate Change. I am in support of the agriculture insurance. We have to continue with the negotiations on agricultural insurance, and it should be a public good and not a private item, because to the private companies, it is not a viable business. And we are looking at this as something to motivate our youth and women and men remain in agricultural production. Because all of us here within the 12 hours, we have eating on the agenda. So if the men and youth quit agricultural production because of the disappointment in the performance, we shall not have food on the table. Thank you, Bread for the World. You are very evident in my country. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ramesh Babu. I am from India. I work with a Christian group in India, and this question is very similar to my friend from India who asked the first question in terms of the agriculture position in the in the negotiations. It's good to see most of you are having pink badges. So are you satisfied with the position that has in this Morocco our discussions? That's one. Two, in terms of how do you see the roadmap, in terms of agriculture in its position, pre-2020, how do we, deal with that? The third question is also, ma'am from Fiji, she did mention about the church role. It's very important to know the religious institutions' role in combating climate change. What are the kind of limitations that you face, in order to make decisions? And a colleague from Bread for the World, ma'am, you did mention about the unaffordable premiums. So how do you deal with that? Because in India also we face a lot of such problems, so much of delay, even it is affordable, but a lot of delay in compensation. So how do you deal with that? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will give the floor to the panelists to respond to those questions, and then we'll come to a second round where I will ask all the participants to just ask one question. You've got the floor. Should we start with Sabina?
Thank you very much for the very, very useful comments. So I think first of all, I'm always very interested to hear when the insurance was not working, and what were the reasons. And I think we have to make a lot of analysis on it to improve it, to make it more efficient. And that's also where we see that we as a humanitarian network can actually play a role to make it more efficient, because we are on the ground. We know better the needs of the people than probably the government itself. Not when I say we, I mean the development organizations in the countries themselves who are members of us. So, and then the second thing, how to deal with making them more affordable. Well, I see that's the obligation of the industrialized countries plus those who have the capacities to do so. Like, I would also not leave Saudi Arabia out of this obligation to finance the subsidies and to make them more affordable. That's not a task of an aid organization. What we do is we provide help and finance for doing projects, but not developing climate risk insurance ourselves, but enable our partners to engage, like such a way Chandra has described it here. And I think we have to get more lobby efforts also towards making visible and understandable where, in which case, for example, the premium support was unaffordable, and also like in a way that it is very unfair. So, this what we have to flag. I mean, there are countries who have different infrastructure, and it makes it more expensive for governments to pay for that. Yeah, but I think premium support is a big topic for humanitarian development organizations.
Thank you for all the insightful questions, which are quite very, very revealing. I will just maybe pick on two. The first, which has to do with the mention of agriculture in the draft conclusions, but that of loss and damage missing. So this is still a draft, but these are issues that I did say when I was making my comments there, that we must make sure that issues of loss and damage does not drop from the negotiations as well as from the text. Once we start diluting it, eventually it will not come out very strong. Agreed that agriculture has been mentioned there, but it's not really quite sufficient as it should be. Loss and damage ought to have featured in the draft conclusion. So going forward, we keep on ensuring that it is reflected. The second thing I want to talk about to respond is the issue of role of churches and other communities. Our own experience back in Nigeria is that we have community-based associations, some under the religious faith organizations, and then some are just cultural setting. We have a lot of women organizations too that are involved. These are formidable platforms which we disseminate information, and also through using all these entities, we are able to ensure that we get a feedback on what is their feeling, what is the expectation from government, what should be done to support them to adapt to the impact of climate change, and also even to see a framework of deploying services by government towards bringing some relief to them. But there are some challenges around these kind of organizations, because many a times they are so fragmented. But probably with the church setting is much more better, because there's usually a centralized leadership and all other branches are under that centralized leadership. But in some of the women organizations and some of the religious settings that we have back home, it's a standalone kind of entities. So there is a need to find a way of bringing them together under a centralized umbrella for ease of communication and ease for deployment of all services that should go to them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Before I would like to respond to the question, I would like to comment on Sabine, your statement. It's always a pleasure to discuss with you. You said that the ACT Alliance is a huge network, and you have also the alliance also has to deal with a matter, if I'm not mistaken. Please correct me if I'm wrong. For example, we're together with the UK Department for International Development. We're currently developing a structured fund which will develop insurance policies for humanitarian organizations. It's called, and the humanitarian, many humanitarian organizations have come together and formed the START network. I don't know whether the ACT Alliance and Rot für die Welt is a member of it already. I would encourage you to become member, if not yet, because it makes a lot of sense also from the perspective of humanitarian organizations in making use of this new instrument of insurance instead of solely relying on donations. However, if I try to imagine from the point of view of a humanitarian organization heavily reliant on donations, it's quite a I could assume it's quite a communication challenge to say, give me your donations, I will put this, take it to pay a premium. So I would be very interested in how you internally discuss this matter in approaching it. It's, of course, it's always easy to say, well, we want to go for that, but somebody else has to pay the premium for us. On the other message, there's no money, zero money for loss and damage on the table. I would slightly disagree with you. There's a lot of money which is being invested on loss and damage. For example, the whole humanitarian finance, which goes into addressing natural disasters. And that's what we also, we have a common challenge. We as an international community, we all, that we see also humanitarian finance goes into crisis, conflicts, earthquakes. Yesterday, I read a paper saying the earthquake of Haiti was due to the impacts of climate change. I really haven't seen the proof for this yet. But anyway, we are confronted with the fact that the challenge for humanitarian finance need is just, cannot be addressed anymore. And so we need to find new ways. And that's why we also, start thinking on how can we inject more efficiency in the sector. And one issue is using insurance, using parametric insurance, because, as you said, it's far quicker, and also we can much less volumes of money can achieve much more impact. There are studies saying it's 1 to 4. So that's also motivation for us in scrutinizing the potentials, but also the limitations, of course, in using insurance also in further developing humanitarian finance. On the agricultural agenda item, I haven't followed it, I have to say. I think in the adaptation agenda, I think there's a lot which has a huge relevance to the adaptation negotiation stream. Therefore, having largely followed the adaptation track, I'm not so much worried about the agricultural part. Thank you. Okay, I may leave it as such. There was the question on agricultural insurance. I think I'm not an expert on the various schemes, but I think we need to take this very serious. And I talked a little bit about risk layering and integrating sovereign risk pools with national insurance. I think the Mexican example of Fonden is a good example, not with regard to agricultural insurance, but disaster risk finance, and probably that's a way to go for. But every country is very specific, and we need to address it case by case. Thank you.
You've got 3 minutes, Chandra.
Oh, sure. I'll take 3 minutes. Just to say that, Godfrey, humanitarian is not only supported by developed countries. A lot of developing countries
Definitely.
do fund humanitarian.
Yeah.
And therefore, they can say that they're also contributing to loss and damage. According to your definition, which I don't agree with, that's a different issue. Okay. Coming back to agriculture debate, I'll just answer that. I think there is a twisted argument happening here, whether agriculture should be looked from the prism of mitigation or it should be looked from the prism of adaptation. And I believe it's a no-win argument. Whether you look from one prism or another prism, the output is going to be, you need agriculture system which is sustainable and where you can sustain the farmers. You can look at it from the perspective of adaptation and get mitigation benefit. There could be mitigation co-benefit. But if you start looking at agriculture from market perspective, that's what a lot of developed countries are looking at. That how do we store carbon in soil and sell the carbon credit? I don't think that's the way to look at it, because a lot of adaptation work of good agricultural practice will give you climate co-benefit. About the issue of just to go back to what I said, I'm not saying that you will have one agriculture insurance that every country will adapt. It has to be a national program. By the end of the day, you need to show the money. Agriculture insurance is not only about sharing information and best practices. It is about putting money on the table so that someone can afford that insurance. The fact of the matter is, majority cannot afford because they don't have money. And therefore, when I say a global insurance mechanism, it's largely about putting money on the table so that someone can afford it. You could keep doing best practices. You can keep, sharing knowledge and developing partnership, but the buck will stop when there's money for people to adopt agriculture insurance mechanism.
Thank you very much. Ms. Powell.
Thank you. I think I will direct my question this way again. In terms of, you said there's $0 to loss and damage, and you said there's a lot of money. Maybe you can help us with that in accessing and how we can access that in terms of financing our relocation. And in terms of agriculture insurance, maybe we can help the government as well to assist Fiji in that, in building that guideline. Go to the church, yes, it's a challenging issue. And I guess we need to come up with a proper guideline framework where the church can play that crucial role in leadership.
Thank you very much. We are running out of time, so I will take 2 more questions that I had already indicated, and it is the lady behind you. My apologies, please. The lady behind you. I would like to give the floor to the lady behind you, and then after that, we will give it to the gentleman in front of you.
Yeah, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. My name is Mary Marete. I'm from the World Council of Churches Ecumenical Advocacy Alliance. I work with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and we support the most marginalized and vulnerable communities. So this has been a very interesting, informative, and engaging conversation. For me, I was very curious about the comment that if you are focused on the most vulnerable, you may take 5 to 10 years to be able to move forward. I don't know if I got that correct, but there are models that can be developed to engage the most vulnerable. For instance, when you come to the business models that are being developed by looking at the bottom of the pyramid approach that can benefit both businesses as well as the communities that are affected, we can somehow engage the most vulnerable in helping decide how this insurance should take form. So I do disagree a little bit there that we can't really reach out to those who are most vulnerable in this insurance conversation.
Thank you for your question. Can we take yours briefly? And I apologize for my asking you to do it a bit faster. Thank you.
My name is Oliver Morris, and I am the director of the International National Trusts Organization, which is an overarching body for national and heritage trusts around the world, including the Fiji National Trust. And my question relates to evaluation of loss and damage insofar as it affects cultures, because your point, Madam, was about the loss. I think you said coping with disconnection. Is any form of evaluation being applied to the loss of the culture of a country like Fiji, for example, when an organization, when a village has to move and they lose their fishing culture, their different cultures, is it being evaluated as far as loss and damage is concerned? Thank you.
Well, I will give the floor to the panelists, starting with the gentleman from Germany.
Yeah, very briefly.
Very briefly, yes.
First, there was the question from Teresa. We have a large program in the Pacific implemented by GIZ, and we will. It's not an announcement, but we will address the issue of displacement migration in the Pacific, in other regions of the world more closely, and we'll come back. We'll need to engage with the government on that issue. On the issue of engaging the most vulnerable, I didn't say that it takes too long to engage with the most vulnerable. No, all the programs we are also setting up in the Insure Resilience Initiative, they have to be geared towards the poor and vulnerable. We have just published a pro-poor study. It was done by the Munich Climate Insurance Initiative, and you can find it on their website. I mean, I think it's a very good study. It has some insurance principle which encompass all these issues, and they come with operational criteria how to which we will put as a precondition for all the funds which will be supported, that they address the most the poor and vulnerable. So I only said that it takes a long time to set up infrastructure like climate services and weather data for rolling out agricultural insurance. It's a very ambitious and long-term exercise. And I said that we do it through a multi-layered risk layering approaches.
Thank you.
It was one thing, social safety nets, very important. The churches can play a very important role. effectiveness of social safety nets for delivery of climate insurance payouts is a very important issue. We need to address that. We need to analyze that. And last point was on non-economic losses. It's one of the 5 strategic work streams in the Executive Committee for the Warsaw Mechanism. Thank you.
I'm afraid we've run out of time, and my apologies for the colleagues who had promised I'd give them a chance to ask a question. It is what it is, and I believe I have built my capacity in as far as how to ensure that comments and inputs fit within the time frame. On behalf of CSE and Act Alliance, we thank you so much for your participation. We appreciate the input from the panelists, and we appreciate the collaborative spirit that has been reigning in this room today, and we hope we will work together as we tackle this important issue within climate change negotiations, climate change action, and climate change policy. Thank you very much.
I agree with that. We would engage as we flesh out the ideas. I think a lot of them Caribbean intelligence and everything can be built into.
Yeah. They want to this lifelong reflection. They want to scale this. Yep.
Chandra, I remember me from Arena. I just saw you were speaking here, so I came to say hi. That's it.
Thank you so much, sir.
Yeah, thank you too. What's your name? I'm sorry. Okay.
Listen, nice to meet you again.
Also, nice to meet you. Are you also from CSE? Okay. Yeah, thank you.